Hi guys. Tonight we drift back more than 1,000 years to a world before GPS or even reliable maps. You stand on a grey northern shore, breath steaming in the chill air, listening to the endless whisper of the North Atlantic. Somewhere in the distance, waves crash against stone, and the scent of salt and tar mingles with wood smoke from a nearby hall. You can almost hear the creak of a longship being pushed toward the tide. It's dark, cold, and damp, and yet the people who lived here understood this sea better than most of us ever will. They didn't just sail it, they listened to it, read it, even smelled it, and you probably wouldn't survive a single crossing in their world. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. You trudge closer to the waterline, boots sinking into the thick sand, and feel that strange pulse of energy that Viking sailors once called Hafit, the sea sense. It wasn't superstition, at least not entirely. It was a body-learned instinct, sharpened through repetition, hunger, and survival. Each ripple on the surface, each sigh of wind through rigging, carried a language, a message if you knew how to hear it. Imagine being one of them. No compass, no charts, no weather forecast. Just a wooden hull, a canvas sail, and a horizon that could swallow you whole. Yet somehow, these seafarers reached Iceland, Greenland, even the coast of North America centuries before Columbus dreamed of a compass rose. Historians still argue whether Leif Erikson truly landed at Longship Meadows by design or by accident, but either way, the navigation that got him there remains astounding. The mainstream fact is simple. The Vikings were expert sailors who could cross open seas with accuracy far beyond what should have been possible for their time. But the quirky truth is that they did it by blending observation with a strange, almost spiritual intimacy with nature. They didn't separate science from story. The sea was alive, a living mind that could be read through signs. A ring around the moon meant storms. The sound of distant breakers could signal unseen land. You walk along the edge of the surf, waves licking at your ankles. Every splash feels like a heartbeat, ancient and rhythmic. The water is freezing, but there's something hypnotic in its movement. Picture yourself aboard a longship now, the Nar, a stout cargo vessel made for endurance. You sway with the tide, hearing the crew murmuring in Old Norse, rough syllables blending with gull cries. Somewhere, a helmsman presses his hand to the rudder's tiller, feeling the ship's vibration like a pulse through the timber. That's how they sense direction, through touch, through resonance. As night deepens, the stars appear one by one. No sextant, no telescope, just naked eyes trained by generations of storytelling. They'd pass down constellations through sagas and songs. The North Star wasn't a coordinate, it was a companion. When you see it glinting steady above the mast, you understand how its loyalty could comfort them. Some said it was the eye of Odin, watching their voyages. Others, more pragmatic, used it to find true north. But long before the stars guided them, sound did. You listen now beyond the slap of water against hull, beyond the creak of oars. The Vikings could identify distance to shore by the echo of waves bouncing off cliffs, a trick rediscovered by modern acoustic science. In dense fog, they'd strike the water with oars or sing low notes to test how sound traveled. Different tones came back with different textures, sharp if rocks were near, dull if open sea. It's strange, isn't it? Modern sonar works on the same principle, though no one sings to the sea anymore. You glance toward the horizon. It's hard to tell where the sky ends and water begins. That's exactly what they faced every voyage, every storm. Yet instead of panic, there was rhythm. Each man aboard had a role in reading that horizon. The oarsman felt the drag change when currents shifted. The steersman noted how the clouds moved. The cook smelled the air for hints of rain or fish. They didn't think of these as separate senses. It was one great, shared perception of place. At times, that sense bordered on eerie. There are accounts half folklore, half memory of sailors claiming to feel the nearness of land in their bones. Some swore their teeth tingled when freshwater rivers flowed nearby. Historians debate whether that's myth or an early recognition of subtle salinity changes, detectable through taste and skin. Even modern scientists admit the human body can perceive slight chemical differences in air and moisture, though we've largely lost the ability to notice. A cold gust brushes your face, bringing the smell of kelp and driftwood. You realize that in this world, every detail mattered. The Vikings didn't fight the sea, they negotiated with it. They built ships that could flex with waves rather than resist them, using overlapping planks riveted with iron nails. The sound of those nails under stress told a captain how much strain the hull could take. That's not poetry, it's practical engineering cloaked in experience. You close your eyes for a moment, feeling the wind push and pull. The sea doesn't roar tonight. It hums, steady and low. It's the same hum those sailors once fell asleep to, trusting it to cradle them through the dark. You start to sense why they treated it almost like a god, not one to worship in fear, but to respect as an unpredictable friend. The boundary between reality and imagination softens. In that soft blur, you glimpse how knowledge once felt, embodied, not written. A sailor didn't know the route to Iceland. He was the route, his muscle memory tracing invisible lines across waves and stars. Maybe that's what we've forgotten, not just the facts, but the feeling of belonging to something vast and alive. You stand still, the tide creeping higher. The horizon glows faintly with moonlight, silvering every ripple. Somewhere behind you, a horn sounds the call of departure. You're ready now. You've listened to the whispers of salt and night. The voyage begins. You're standing on the deck now, the wooden boards damp beneath your boots, the air vibrating with quiet expectation. The sea stretches out like a dark mirror, and you realize that everything depends on listening. Not just hearing, but truly listening. Viking sailors were masters of this skill, long before the age of instruments or compasses. They called it sea ear, an instinct that came from years of exposure, patience, and the kind of silence that presses against you when there's nothing but water in every direction. The first thing you notice is the absence of sound. When the sea goes quiet, it isn't peace, it's warning. Every old sailor knew that. A sudden stillness often meant fog was rolling in, or that a storm was building somewhere beyond sight. You can almost feel that pressure now, like the air itself is holding its breath. The Vikings didn't panic when silence came. They leaned into it, tilted their heads, and waited. They could tell the shape of land by how waves echoed against it. A sharp slap meant cliffs, a hollow thud meant sand, a whisper meant marshes. They learned to test the air with sound, sometimes humming, sometimes tapping the hull with a wooden peg. The echo that came back was their map. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate form of proto-sonar or simply an instinct developed over time. Either way, it worked. There are records from Icelandic sagas describing sailors finding fjord entrances in total fog simply by listening to how waves rebounded. You crouch near the side of the ship, letting your fingers trail in the water. It's colder than you expected, biting like metal. The sound of it is layered lapping waves, distant gulls, the low groan of the hull. Each layer carries information. A Viking could tell if icebergs were near by the way waves broke. He could tell if a river mouth was close by the dullness of the swell. It's strange how much of that we've forgotten. Now we stare at digital screens instead of the horizon, waiting for algorithms to warn us what our ancestors could sense naturally. There's a moment when the fog begins to move in. It's not white, it's grey and heavy, like a living thing. The ship grows smaller inside it, muffled by mist. The helmsman leans closer to the water, one hand steady on the rudder, the other cupped to his ear. You can almost hear what he's hearing. The distant roll of breakers, the rhythm of waves striking stones somewhere far ahead. He listens for gulls, too. Seabirds never stray too far from land. If their cries fade, it means open sea. If they grow louder, it means safety is near. The mainstream historical fact here is that Viking navigators used auditory cues as part of their toolkit, especially in coastal sailing. They could tell direction by the way waves angled against the hull, even in darkness. The quirky detail is that some accounts mention sailors singing into the fog, long drawn-out notes meant to test how sound traveled. Each voice carried a specific tone, and experienced ears could tell whether the note came back stretched or compressed, signaling distance to obstacles. Historians still debate if this was purely practical or if it carried ritual significance, part chant, part navigation. As you listen, you start to notice that the sea itself has a voice. It mutters and sighs, sometimes grumbles. The Vikings believed these sounds carried messages from the gods, or at least from the sea spirits who guarded certain waters. To ignore those voices was foolish. There were even rituals before long voyages, when the crew would gather in silence, listening for omens in the surf. A sudden splash could mean good fortune. A gull's cry at midnight could mean death. The fog thickens. You can't see more than a few feet ahead. Someone hums a deep, steady tone. The sound rolls over the deck and fades into the mist. A moment later, a faint echo returns, stretched and hollow. The helmsman nods. That echo tells him what direction to turn. You realize you're watching a kind of conversation between man and ocean, one we've forgotten how to join. You move toward the prow, where the carved dragon head peers into the haze. The wood feels slick beneath your hand, worn smooth by salt. You can hear the creak of the mast and the slap of loose ropes against the sail. Every sound is a heartbeat of the ship. Viking sailors claimed they could tell when the vessel was healthy or when it was close to breaking just by the tone of its groan. Modern shipwrights confirm this timber resonates differently when stressed or cracked. The human ear, trained long enough, can hear the difference. A gust of wind cuts through, snapping the sail taut. The fog shivers and breaks apart, revealing a dim horizon painted in cold blue. You can smell the promise of land before you see it, the faint, earthy tang that means soil instead of salt. The crew murmurs in approval. They never doubted their course. They trusted what they heard. You lean back, listening to the quiet fade into wind again. It's peaceful, but also humbling. Somewhere deep inside, you realize how much modern noise has cost us. We drown out silence with engines, music, chatter. The Vikings did the opposite. They carved meaning out of quiet. The ship glides forward now, oars dipping in rhythm. You can almost fall asleep to the sound of it. The wooden blades slide through the water, each stroke a whisper, each splash a story. Somewhere, a sailor hums under his breath a low tune meant to match the sea's pulse. It isn't a song to pass time, it's communication. You can feel it in your bones, that deep connection between human rhythm and ocean rhythm. The horizon brightens slightly, and the fog begins to dissolve. The crew relaxes, some wiping the mist from their brows, others laughing softly. You realize you've crossed something invisible, a line between fear and familiarity, between chaos and comprehension. The Vikings didn't conquer the sea, they learned to listen until it let them pass. You close your eyes, letting the last notes of that sea song fade. The water hushes around you, the ship steady and sure beneath your feet. For a moment, you almost believe you could navigate by sound too, if you only learned to listen long enough. You lean over the ship's side, fingertips grazing the cold surface of the sea. The water rolls like liquid glass, dark and heavy beneath a pale sky. Every ripple carries meaning, every swirl tells a quiet story. To Viking sailors, the ocean was not chaos but a conversation. They read it like language, one that spoke in textures and movements instead of words. As you trail your hand, you feel how the current changes direction, almost imperceptibly. To you, it is just a chill between your fingers. To a Viking, it was a clue. They understood the sea's dialects, the difference between the pulse of deep ocean and the slow drag of a nearshore tide. Long before written charts existed, these seafarers learned to read currents through their senses. Modern oceanographers confirm that subtle shifts in temperature, foam, and flow could indeed reveal location, though we've lost that intimacy. Records from Icelandic sagas hint at sailors who could identify when they were nearing the Faroes just by feeling the resistance of water against the oar. They believed the sea there tightened its grip, as if the land pulled at it from below. It sounds like poetry, yet hydrodynamic studies today show that undersea topography does influence surface tension and wave pattern. The old mariners didn't know the science, they didn't need to. Their skin told them the truth first. One peculiar fragment of lore says that a sailor could tell direction by dragging a hand behind the stern and studying the trails of foam. Smooth bubbles meant tailwind, jagged trails meant cross-current. Whether that was truly reliable or not, no one can be certain. Maritime archaeologists still discuss whether such descriptions were literal or symbolic, a kind of sensory shorthand passed down through stories. But there is beauty in the image of men trusting their fingers as much as their eyes. You look down again and see how the light dances over the waves, turning them from slate to silver in an instant. The Vikings noticed this too. They used the play of color on water to gauge depth. Shallow waters glimmered with turquoise when sunlight hit the sand below. Deeper channels dulled to grey-green, while regions rich with plankton glowed faintly in twilight. Even now, sailors call this the color of depth, a practice the Norse perfected centuries before sonar. Imagine sailing at dawn, surrounded by fog so thick you could barely see your own hand. A faint glow in the water ahead might reveal an approaching current, or the shimmer of ice beneath the surface. They watched how foam clustered along a current's edge, how seabirds drifted along invisible lines of motion. These signs formed a living map. You begin to understand that navigation was never just about stars. It was about texture, smell, temperature, and intuition combined. It's fascinating to realize how much of this wisdom was embodied. They didn't keep written manuals, no neat lists of how to read the sea. Instead, the knowledge lived in muscle and instinct, passed from father to son, from sailor to apprentice. When one old navigator died, part of the ocean's memory went with him. Some historians think that's why Norse oral culture treated seafaring songs with such reverence. They weren't entertainment, they were preservation. You close your eyes and picture a ship lost in fog, surrounded by grey silence. The crew sits still, waiting. The helmsman feels the current tug at the rudder. He senses it not through logic, but through familiarity. It's a strange partnership, man and water. Modern psychology might call it pattern recognition. The Vikings might have called it respect. There's a story about a helmsman named Arne, who claimed he could find Iceland even when clouds hid both sun and stars. He would drop bits of wood into the sea and watch how they turned. If the wood spun clockwise, he said, the current pulled toward home. If it drifted straight, he was still far out. Whether that worked or not, no one can prove. Some researchers suggest he was observing surface drift caused by the Gulf Stream centuries before anyone mapped it. You feel the rhythm of the waves now, a steady push and pull beneath your feet. Each motion has its own personality. Some are gentle and rounded, shaped by open water. Others are short, choppy, born of nearby land. The Vikings gave them names: soft ones, harsh ones, all with character. They knew that a sudden change in rhythm meant a shift in geography. Somewhere below, something new was rising from the depths. Your attention drifts to the horizon again. The sea looks endless, but the Vikings knew better. They saw borders where we see nothing. The faintest ripple line could mark the edge of one current and the beginning of another. That boundary meant transition, perhaps from safety to danger, or from familiar to unknown. Modern scientists marvel at how accurately Norse sailors tracked these zones, though they lacked any tools for measurement. Satellite imaging later revealed patterns that mirror ancient routes, proving that these people understood more than they were ever given credit for. Their navigation wasn't superstition, it was observation refined over centuries. As the wind rises, you feel droplets of spray touch your face. Cold, sharp, awakening. For a moment, you understand what it means to trust the sea's language. To modern ears, it might sound romantic, but to them it was survival. Misreading the water could mean death. Reading it well could mean landfall. You step back from the edge, letting the rhythm of the ship carry you. The water still murmurs below, whispering secrets only the patient can hear. Somewhere deep inside, you realize that knowledge isn't always written in books. Sometimes it flows, drifts, and ripples alive, waiting for anyone quiet enough to listen. Night folds itself around the Longship like a soft cloak. The sea breathes slow and steady beneath you, while the sky opens wide with cold fire. Up there, the stars seem impossibly sharp, so clear they almost hum. This is the world's oldest navigation chart, written not in ink but in light. You tilt your head back, and the heavens swirl with stories. The Vikings knew them all. Long before telescopes, before compasses, they sailed by these flickering points. Yet they didn't see them the way we do. You and I look for constellations, tidy shapes made up by long-dead astronomers. They saw families, rivalries, warnings. The stars were alive, always shifting, their relationships as meaningful as their brightness. To steer by them, you didn't memorize patterns. You memorized the spaces between them. Evidence from medieval Norse texts hints that navigators treated the night sky as a kind of musical score. Each star had rhythm, a position within a greater harmony. Modern astrophysicists have noted that the Vikings' sky maps seem to focus on angles rather than fixed lines, using distances between stars to maintain direction. It's like hearing a song and knowing when a note is slightly off-key. You might not measure it, but you feel it. A curious detail from a 13th century Icelandic manuscript describes something few people notice today. Sailors would stare at the stars until their vision blurred and then move their eyes slightly to the side. In that soft gaze, they saw dimmer stars invisible to direct sight. They didn't understand why it worked, but modern physiology explains it. Human eyes detect faint light better off-center. Somehow, the Vikings had already discovered that through experience. You look up now, trying it yourself. The sky deepens into endless blue-black. If you focus too hard, the stars vanish. If you relax, they bloom again. You understand what they knew. Navigation isn't just about looking, it's about seeing. The North Star, steady and bright, served as anchor. It marked north, constant through seasons. But even that wasn't simple. Vikings called it Latitude, the guiding star, and believed it linked the human world to the halls of the gods. Its position above the horizon could reveal your latitude, though they had no instruments to measure it. Some scholars suggest they used their fists, stacked edge to edge, to estimate degrees, a surprisingly accurate trick rediscovered by modern survivalists. Still, the sky wasn't always clear. Fog, clouds, or endless summer daylight in northern latitudes often hid the stars. What then? They watched the space between. The faint glimmer of dusk on one horizon or the stretch of dawn on another told them the sun's hidden position. They even noted how the color of twilight lingered longer in one direction. From that, they could guess orientation. It's astonishing how little light they needed to find their way. You can almost hear their quiet discussions, low voices naming constellations like Friends, the Bear, the Swan, the Wain. Each one held not just direction but moral meaning. The Bear guarded travelers. The Swan warned of storms. The Wain, our Big Dipper, pointed the path home. Their mythology and geography were intertwined. To navigate was also to remember the stories that shaped the stars themselves. One ancient fragment mentions a shifting star that some believed foretold rough seas. It might have been a planet mistaken for a wandering light. The crew would argue softly about what it meant. Some said it was Thor's torch. Others said it was the eye of a drowned man. Whether superstition or signal, those lights stirred imagination and caution alike. Modern researchers note that such myths often encoded practical knowledge. When certain planets rose at specific seasons, the winds also changed. You imagine being on that dark deck, breath steaming, eyes lifted to infinity. No compass. No compass rose. No error margin. Only trust in patterns, in memory, in the unbroken line between ship and sky. Even today, the simplicity feels sacred. We've traded awe for precision. They had both, wrapped together. The rhythm of oars slows as the night deepens. Somewhere a man hums an old verse about the whale road, the sea stretching to the end of the world. The stars shimmer like frost. You realize that each sailor carried his own internal map, made not of ink but of light and muscle memory. Navigation was almost a meditation, a balance between awareness and surrender. A fragment from a later chronicle tells of a helmsman who claimed he could sense when clouds covered a star by the change in his heartbeat. Scientists might scoff, but even now, pilots speak of spatial disorientation when deprived of stars. The body knows more than we give it credit for. The Vikings trusted that knowledge completely. Now the sky turns faintly silver at the edges. Dawn approaches, erasing constellations one by one. You feel a pang of loss as they fade, as if friends are slipping quietly below the horizon. But the sailors don't mourn. They turn to a new light, another tool waiting to guide them. The stars rest, but the sea never sleeps. The dawn creeps up softly, pale gold brushing the edge of the sea. The stars retreat one by one, and the air fills with that strange quiet before the world decides to wake. You stand near the prow, watching sunlight break through a drifting veil of mist. The crew stirs, adjusting ropes, murmuring in the low rhythm of routine. But one man remains still, holding a small crystal to the sky. It catches the light and glows faintly. You realize you are seeing something that borders between myth and science. That crystal is what later ages called a sunstone, not a gem of legend, but a real piece of calcite or cordierite that Viking sailors may have used to locate the hidden sun on cloudy days. The idea sounds fantastical, almost too clever to be ancient, yet fragments of Icelandic sagas describe it plainly. One verse tells of King Olaf's navigator, who held up a stone to find the sun's direction when fog had swallowed the sky. For centuries, historians dismissed it as poetic invention. Then mineralogists tested the concept, and the results astonished them. It turns out that certain crystals can polarize light, splitting it into distinct rays. When rotated, one ray brightens and one darkens, revealing the orientation of the sun even when invisible. Modern experiments in Iceland and Denmark prove the method works with remarkable accuracy, within a few degrees of true solar position. So what once sounded like magic was, in fact, early optics. The Vikings may have discovered it by chance, or through patient observation of nature's quirks. One curious note from a 10th century text mentions that sailors sometimes kept two such stones of different colors, perhaps to test which gave the clearer reading. Whether that practice was real or imagined, it reveals how methodical these mariners were. They didn't rely on luck alone. They experimented, compared, and refined. A handful of navigators may have been what we'd now call scientists, though they wouldn't have used that word. Still, not everyone agrees on how widespread the practice was. Some researchers think the sunstone was more symbolic than practical, a charm representing clarity of sight. Others argue it was essential equipment, particularly in northern latitudes where twilight could last all night. The debate continues, swaying between evidence and imagination. But you can picture it easily, a helmsman lifting a glowing shard toward a grey sky, watching the faint flash of light that points the way. You try to imagine the feeling of that moment. The world around you is featureless, the horizon blurred into mist. Yet, in your palm, a small crystal burns with secret knowledge. You rotate it slowly, watching the brightness shift. Somewhere inside that play of light lies the direction of east. It is both simple and profound. This connection between perception and survival runs deep in Norse seafaring. They paid attention to phenomena modern people rarely notice: how light changes on the water's surface, how brightness bends across clouds, how reflections drift in the wet planks of the ship. These patterns became their compass. They read polarization, glare, and the subtle shimmer of morning haze, as if they were letters in a vast alphabet of sky and sea. The crew begins to hoist the sail. Sunlight spreads through the mist, turning it to molten silver. The longship's carved dragon head gleams, droplets sliding from its jaws. You hear laughter now, the kind that comes from relief the storm has passed. The way is clear. Someone pockets the sunstone, wrapping it carefully in cloth, and you realize it is not treated like treasure, but like a tool, useful, humble, quietly miraculous. Archaeologists once doubted that Vikings could have mastered such subtle methods of navigation. Then a fragment of calcite was found in a British shipwreck from centuries later, hinting that the technique might have endured long after the Viking Age. Some experts even suggest that this lost art influenced later mariners without anyone realizing its origin. That thought lingers. How many modern inventions were rediscoveries of forgotten wisdom? You step closer to the edge, letting the brightening wind brush your face. The world feels sharper now, colors clearer after the grey. The sea reflects the sun in shards of gold, and for a moment you see how a sailor might think of the water as liquid light. That's what the sunstone captured, a fragment of that brilliance, held steady in one's hand. Another voice within you wonders what it must have felt like to trust such fragile tools. One cloudy morning could mean life or death, and yet they faced it calmly. The crystal might fail, the clouds might thicken, but they believed that persistence revealed direction eventually. There's a quiet lesson there, one that transcends centuries. Sometimes, when clarity hides, patience is the true compass. You glance back toward the crew. Their movements are unhurried, confident. They don't rush the sea, they move with it. Every sound, the creak of ropes, the flap of the sail seems to echo that balance between control and surrender. The sun climbs higher now, breaking the last threads of mist. The horizon opens wide, dazzling and clean. The voyage continues, guided by a flicker of light caught in a crystal, and by instincts older than memory. The sun climbs higher, and the longship begins to move with a steady pulse. The sail fills with wind, its woven wool catching invisible power. The ropes tighten, the mast groans softly, and the ship comes alive. You can almost feel the heartbeat of the vessel beneath your feet. The Vikings understood this dance better than anyone. To them, the wind was both an adversary and an ally, a living force that could carry or crush. They learned to tame it through sound and touch, not through numbers. You close your eyes for a moment and listen. The canvas thrums, deep and rhythmic. The ropes whistle. Somewhere, a sailor adjusts a knot with deliberate calm. This is not guesswork, it is conversation. The longship answers to every adjustment, and the crew listens like musicians fine-tuning an instrument. Archaeological reconstructions of Viking ships reveal how carefully these vessels were designed for the northern seas. The square sail, simple in appearance, was a masterpiece of flexibility. Its angle could be altered slightly to catch or spill air, giving the crew control in unpredictable gusts. Modern wind tunnel tests confirm that these sails could perform surprisingly well even when sailing across the wind, not just with it. It's remarkable how engineering and intuition worked hand in hand long before aerodynamics had a name. One rarely discussed fact about Viking rigging is that the sailcloth itself carried layers of meaning. They soaked it in animal fat, fish oil, or even milk to make it resistant to water and wind. Each crew had its own recipe, passed down like a family secret. The mixture not only waterproofed the sail but also changed its color, sometimes giving it a reddish hue under sunlight. That shimmer could serve as a signal to distant allies or a warning to rivals. You watch as the wind shifts slightly, and the helmsman adjusts course without a word. His hand rests lightly on the tiller, yet every small movement counts. The balance between sail, rudder, and sea is delicate. Modern sailors use instruments to detect such changes. The Vikings relied entirely on their bodies. They could feel a change in the wind direction through the texture of air on their cheeks. That may sound exaggerated, but studies on long-distance rowers and traditional sailors show how heightened awareness develops after years at sea. The Vikings simply embodied it. There's a story from an old Greenlandic chronicle about a sailor who could predict wind by the way the smoke from his pipe bent. He would blow a ring, watch it twist, and declare what kind of day awaited them. People laughed at his superstition until his predictions proved true time after time. Modern meteorology would explain it as reading microcurrents and humidity, but to his shipmates, it was magic. The line between skill and sorcery was always blurred on the open ocean. The wind stiffens now, and the ship begins to lean slightly. The crew responds instinctively. Some tighten ropes, others shift weight. They don't speak. Every gesture is practiced, every movement part of a shared rhythm. It's as if the entire vessel is one body breathing in harmony with the sea. You can see why later poets described longships as living creatures. Their prows lifted like heads, their sails became lungs. The Vikings treated them with the respect due to a companion. A curious tradition mentioned in several sagas describes how some captains spoke to their ships as if to calm them before a storm. The words were gentle, almost like lullabies. Modern historians interpret this as ritualized psychology, a way to steady nerves, but sailors swore it worked. A calm ship, they said, survived better than a fearful one. The wind shifts again, colder now, carrying the faint smell of distant rain. The helmsman looks at the clouds, studying their shape. He doesn't see mere weather, he sees intention. Thick grey lines rising from the horizon mean heavy gusts. Thin streaks across a pale sky mean steady breezes. Every Viking child grew up learning those signs. When they spoke of the wind gods, they were naming patterns of air they understood intimately. You look up at the sail again. It strains, flutters, then settles. The ropes creak with satisfaction. This is the Viking sailor's true art, knowing when to fight and when to yield. A novice might tighten every line, but a veteran loosens some, letting the ship breathe. Even the strongest wind becomes manageable if the sail knows how to dance with it. There's a kind of poetry in that partnership. We often think of control as domination, but here it means listening. When the sea and wind argue, the ship becomes mediator. You, standing here, can almost sense that conversation. 1,000 invisible threads tugging, twisting, balancing. You hear the sigh of wind in the rigging and realize that this sound guided entire civilizations across unknown oceans. As the gust fades, calm returns. The sail flutters softly, catching stray rays of sun. You can smell the oily wool, the salt drying on its surface, the faint musk of tar. These scents once meant safety. They meant movement, direction, hope. The Vikings might not have had compasses, but they had confidence, a trust born of deep intimacy with their craft and the world it sailed through. The horizon gleams ahead, endless and inviting. The ship glides onward, the wind whispering its approval. You feel the same quiet certainty that must have filled those long voyages. Not arrogance, but faith in motion itself. The wind may change, the sea may rise, but those who listen will always find their way. The ship glides steadily now, its hull humming softly as it rides the rolling swells. You rest your hand against the railing and feel a faint vibration beneath your palm, a low thrum like the purring of some great animal. The Vikings often said that a good ship was alive, that the wood itself had a spirit. Looking around, you begin to understand why. Everything here breathes. The ropes shift, the planks creak, the mast sighs. Nothing is still. Each longship had a name, not for vanity but for identity. The Islandingur, the sea stallion, the wave serpent. These weren't poetic titles, they were ways of acknowledging a bond. Before every voyage, the crew would offer a small gesture of respect to their vessel. Sometimes a drop of ale poured across the bow, sometimes a whispered blessing. To them, the ship wasn't a tool, it was a companion with moods and memory. Archaeologists studying ship remains from Roskilde and Oseberg have noticed something remarkable. The timbers were cut so that the natural curve of the tree followed the curve of the hull. This made the wood stronger, more flexible. It also meant that each plank carried the grain's original energy, bending like muscle instead of resisting pressure. You run your fingers along the rail and can almost sense that tension. The tree's life reshaped into a creature that swims instead of stands. One curious note from a 12th century Icelandic saga mentions sailors claiming they could tell if a ship dreamed of land. They said it would hum differently, the sound of its timbers changing tone as it neared shore. Modern researchers can't quite explain this, though some suggest it might have been the resonance of shallow waves reflecting under the hull. The physics make sense, even if the poetry surpasses it. You close your eyes and listen. The ship's voice is low but constant, a mix of groan and rhythm. Each wave makes it speak a little differently. The Vikings knew these voices like family. A sudden new creak could mean danger, a weakened joint, or too much strain. Shipwrights taught their sons to identify such changes by ear, a practice some modern boat builders still use today. They didn't just build ships, they tuned them. At times, the relationship between sailor and ship bordered on devotion. There's an account from a Greenland expedition describing how a crew refused to abandon their sinking vessel. They believed that if they deserted her, their souls would wander forever. Eventually, they lashed themselves to the deck and waited for rescue that never came. Romanticized or not, it reveals the depth of emotion invested in these wooden bodies. The wind shifts again, filling the sail with a deep whoosh. You feel the sudden lift as the ship surges forward, and your heartbeat matches its pace. The helmsman smiles slightly, his eyes on the horizon, his hand firm on the tiller. He doesn't shout orders. He doesn't need to. Every man on board feels what the ship feels. There's no separation between human and vessel. That unity is what kept them alive through storms that would break lesser crews. One lesser-known practice involved listening to the hull through the floorboards. A sailor would press his ear to the deck to judge whether the ship's speed was too high or if currents had changed direction. Modern sailors use instruments for that now, but the principle remains sound literally. Under certain conditions, water flow produces different tones as it rushes along the keel. Experienced ears could tell whether they were gliding over deep ocean or skimming dangerously near shoals. You breathe in the scent of wet pine and tar. It's earthy, comforting. This was the smell of home and survival for the Norse. Shipbuilders spent months preparing wood, coating it with tar made from burning pine roots, a process so potent the aroma could last for decades. That fragrance meant safety. It meant the hull was sealed tight against the cold sea. Even now, replicas of Viking ships carry the same smell, as if memory lingers in every molecule of resin. What fascinates you most is how the Vikings blended engineering with emotion. Their ships were both art and armor. Every line of the hull followed logic, but every carving, every curve, carried soul. The dragon heads at the prow were not decoration. They were guardians, meant to frighten spirits or enemies. Yet when approaching friendly shores, the crew sometimes removed or covered those fierce figures. They believed it was wrong to bring fear to peaceful land. The waves slap gently against the sides. The sound is steady, hypnotic. You start to think of the ship as a living companion, as they did. You picture it dreaming of safe harbors, humming softly in its sleep. Perhaps that is the secret of their success at sea, not just craftsmanship or courage, but empathy. They treated the ocean and their vessel as conscious presences to be understood, not conquered. A modern ship is silent, its engines drowning out all other voices. But here, you hear everything. The rush of water under the keel, the sigh of wind in the rigging, the quiet groan of planks expanding with salt. Each sound is information, each vibration a clue. To the Vikings, this was navigation as much as any star or stone. As the day drifts toward evening, the sea flattens into a glassy calm. The ship slows, resting, as if satisfied. The crew leans back, eyes half closed, listening to the gentle rhythm below. You realize the voyage isn't only about distance, it's about harmony, finding the exact point where wood, wind, and will move as one. You reach down, touch the deck again, and feel it pulse faintly beneath your hand. The ship doesn't need words to tell you, it knows where it's going. The sea changes as you move farther from land. The waves stretch wider, smoother, like the surface of a sleeping creature. You feel the ship ride them gently, gliding rather than striking. The air smells different too, cooler and cleaner, with a faint sweetness that only deep water carries. For Viking sailors, this was familiar territory. They called these open routes Haflither sea paths, invisible highways that connected their scattered world. They knew these paths not by name on parchment, but by the feel of the currents. Every voyage began with studying the tides, watching how they pulled at the shoreline. Some of those currents were seasonal, others eternal. The Vikings memorized them with precision that rivals modern ocean charts. Modern oceanographers, mapping North Atlantic drift patterns, found that many align almost perfectly with the sailing routes described in sagas. What was once legend turns out to be empirical navigation encoded in story. A fascinating record from Greenland describes how mariners predicted currents by watching how kelp drifted. If the seaweed lay flat along the surface, the water was steady. If it twisted or disappeared beneath waves, it meant hidden undercurrents. To test direction, they sometimes tossed bits of wood into the water and watched how they floated compared to the ship's heading. You can picture that small ritual, quiet, simple, endlessly practical. One detail that rarely makes it into textbooks is how they described the sea's colors to mark different zones of travel. The northern drift near Iceland was steel blue, cold and heavy. The southern drift toward Britain was green gold, smoother and warmer. Those weren't just poetic expressions. They reflected variations in light, salinity, and temperature. The sailors read these signs as clearly as we read road signs. Some historians suggest that they memorized sequences of sensory cues rather than abstract distances. A route might go something like this: 2 days of heavy swell, then lighter air, then warmer smell, then a bird cry from the south. It was a symphony of observation, not a list of coordinates. When you think about it, it makes sense. Their world had no maps, so memory became geography. There are old tales of sailors who could sense when they crossed from one current into another because the ship's rhythm changed. They said the sea began to breathe differently. Scientists now understand why. The wavelength and speed of waves vary between warm and cold water, creating distinct motion under the hull. The body, when trained, can detect these differences unconsciously. What might sound mystical was actually deep sensory intelligence. As you stand near the stern, you notice that even here, miles from shore, the air shifts in flavor. There's a hint of iron, perhaps from volcanic dust carried on the wind. The Vikings would have noted that too. They read smell and temperature as part of their compass. Warm, dry air hinted at currents from the south. Sharp, icy gusts meant the northern drift was close. Today we rely on barometers and radar. They relied on their skin. A strange yet beautiful custom persisted among some crews. Before a long voyage, they would throw a small carved figure into the sea and watch how it drifted. If it floated freely in one direction, that was the path they should follow. If it spun or stayed near the ship, they delayed departure. It sounds superstitious, but the motion of that figure revealed surface flow and current resistance. Faith and physics worked quietly together. As afternoon light softens, the water ahead gleams with silvery streaks. These are rip lines where opposing currents meet. Modern sailors mark them as dangerous turbulence zones. The Vikings called them sea seams. They believed that crossing them demanded respect silence, a small offering, perhaps a song. They had learned that when two waters argued, ships broke if they forced their way through carelessly. What fascinates scholars even now is how accurately they timed their voyages to these flows. Archaeological dating shows that expeditions to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland often occurred during the same seasonal windows that modern sailors still consider optimal. They must have kept detailed oral calendars of when each current turned favorable. Those calendars vanished with time. but hints survive in saga descriptions of journeys that always began under the same stars and ended at the same moon. The world around you is still. Only the sound of water slipping along the hull breaks the quiet. You realize that the sea is not uniform at all, it is a vast moving web, a living map in constant motion. The Vikings didn't just cross it, they became part of it. To them, mastery meant harmony. To fight the current was foolish. To follow it was wisdom. As night falls, faint phosphorescence appears in the water. Tiny sparks of green and blue flicker around the ship's sides. The sailors watch them in silence. They called this sea fire, believing it to be the work of spirits guiding their way. We now know it as bioluminescent plankton reacting to motion. The science is modern, but the wonder is ancient. You lean over the edge, watching the glowing trail fade into the darkness. Somewhere below, the current you follow stretches across half the world, unseen yet steady. It connects continents, histories, and hearts. Perhaps that's what the Vikings truly understood, that the ocean is not a barrier, but a thread tying everything together. Morning comes again, pale and clean, with a light wind rippling across the surface of the sea. The air feels softer now, touched by something earthy. You take a deep breath and catch faint traces of pine, tar, and distant smoke. The crew stirs, murmuring with quiet satisfaction. To them, scent is not simply atmosphere, it is information. The Vikings understood that the sea carried smell as surely as it carried sound or light. Before sight or sound could announce land, the nose often did. The first hint of shore was not always visible cliffs or birds overhead, it was the smell of soil, moss, and wood carried on the wind. Accounts from early Norse voyages mention sailors waking from sleep and declaring that they smelled land hours before anyone could see it. Today we might smile at that, yet science supports them. Coastal breezes truly do carry airborne organic compounds from forests and marshes far out to sea. Researchers studying modern navigators in similar environments have confirmed that under calm weather conditions, humans can detect terrestrial scents across dozens of nautical miles. What the Vikings lacked in instruments, they made up for in training their senses. When you live your life exposed to salt, wood, and fish, any deviation stands out. There is a peculiar entry in a medieval Icelandic text that describes a sailor who identified the shores of Greenland by the taste of the wind. The phrase sounds poetic until you realize he meant it literally. The salt in the air tasted sharper, richer with minerals from glacial dust. It was a taste memory as accurate as any visual cue. In an age before weather charts or barometers, taste and smell became early warning systems. Another odd but charming custom appears in several sagas. Before departure, the helmsman would sniff a handful of seaweed collected near the home harbour, then later compare its smell to that of the sea during the journey. If the scent grew fresher or warmer, they believed they were sailing towards similar waters. If it turned acrid, they suspected foreign currents. Whether this ritual truly worked or simply gave confidence is hard to know, but the gesture reveals how physical and intuitive Viking navigation was. You close your eyes and try to sense what they sensed. The breeze touches your skin like cool silk. Beneath the tang of salt lies something richer, resin perhaps from distant pine forests, or the faint sweetness of peat smoke from unseen settlements. It feels like a whisper of home. No instrument could measure such detail, yet to a Norse crew it was enough to confirm direction. Not all smells promised comfort. The sea could warn of danger too. Sailors recognized the odor of approaching storms, a metallic scent that came just before lightning. They also feared the stench of seaweed rotting on hidden reefs, which meant shallow waters or ship-breaking rocks ahead. Their vocabulary for scent was richer than ours. Where we would say fishy or briny, they had dozens of words describing variations of the sea's breath. It is interesting to note that in Norse mythology, smell is often linked to memory and foresight. Odin himself is said to know by scent what happens in distant worlds. Perhaps this belief grew from seafaring life. Smell connects past and present instantly, the scent of home, of tar, of wind over kelp. You can imagine how sailors returning after months away would close their eyes, inhale deeply, and know where they were before any land appeared. You glance toward the mast, where strips of sailcloth dry in the sun. The odor of tar rises strong, mingled with the sharper tang of fish oil used to seal the ropes. It is both unpleasant and reassuring. The same materials that stink also keep the ship alive. There's a lesson in that balance too. The line between foulness and survival is thinner than we think. One of the strangest theories about Viking navigation suggests they might have used dogs to confirm proximity to land. Certain sagas mention shipboard animals trained to bark when they caught familiar scents from home shores. No archaeological evidence confirms this fully, but it would fit their pragmatic creativity. A dog's nose could outmatch any human sense, and sailors were never too proud to learn from nature. The wind shifts, and with it comes a new scent, cold, clean, edged with salt crystals. The helmsman squints toward the horizon. He doesn't see anything yet, but the smell tells him the truth. Open ocean ahead, no land in reach. The crew grows quiet again, settling into rhythm. They trust the air. It strikes you that while we chase precision through technology, they trusted imperfection through attention. They didn't need to be exact, they needed to be aware. In that awareness lies something we've largely forgotten: the body's ability to read the world without translation. You breathe again, slower now, savoring the mix of pine, salt, and distant rain. Each note feels ancient, like a memory too old for words. You wonder how many journeys began with that same breath, and how many ended because a sailor ignored what the wind tried to tell him. The ship glides on, the scent of land fading again, replaced by the deep neutrality of the open sea. For now, the only smell is salt and wood, steady and endless. Somewhere ahead, another coast waits, its invisible perfume already drifting your way. The air is cool and clear as morning deepens, the horizon edged with a faint silver line where sky meets water. A sharp cry breaks the quiet. You look up and see a dark shape cutting across the light, wings stretched wide, feathers flashing. Then another follows and another. The Vikings would have lifted their heads too, recognizing their oldest companions, the seabirds. They learned early that birds were more reliable than compasses. A gull or a puffin does not wander without reason. Each has a pattern, a rhythm that ties it to land and feeding grounds. Watching them could tell a sailor more about distance and direction than any chart. You tilt your face toward the sky, following their arcs, and you begin to see what the Norse navigators saw: a living map written in flight. According to Icelandic accounts, sailors carried trained ravens on board. When they lost sight of land, they released one into the air. If the bird circled and returned, the sea stretched too far. If it flew straight ahead and did not come back, land lay somewhere in that direction. The method is so practical that historians suspect it was common practice, not legend. In fact, the story of Floki Vilgerðarson, the man credited with discovering Iceland, tells how he released 3 ravens to guide his voyage. The first returned quickly, the second hovered and came back uncertain, but the third flew northwest and vanished. Floki followed its path and found the island he sought. What seems like myth now was once a kind of field science. Ornithologists note that ravens, gulls, and auks each have specific flight ranges from land. Observing the height and angle of their flight could tell a sailor not only where to go, but how far they still were from shore. Those who survived enough voyages learned to tell even species apart by wing beat and call. One intriguing fragment from a Norse poem describes how sailors read the speech of the puffins. The phrase puzzled scholars for years until one marine biologist pointed out that puffins cry differently depending on whether they are flying toward feeding grounds or nesting cliffs. To a trained ear, those sounds could indeed serve as direction. Whether the Vikings understood the biology or not, they understood the pattern. You can picture it: a group of sailors standing quietly, eyes narrowed, as a single bird dips low over the sea. They would watch not just its path, but the way the wind pushed against its wings, the distance it covered before turning. Sometimes, they even changed course based on a bird's hesitation. To modern minds, that might seem risky, but these men trusted what the sky told them. A peculiar yet practical detail emerges in a few old travel logs. Some captains brought cages of pigeons on board, not as pets, but as messengers. Released one by one, they could signal to ships behind or return to familiar harbors if a fleet scattered. It was an early form of communication, invisible to history until fragments of wooden cages were found preserved in shipwrecks. Watching the birds, you begin to notice their precision. They rise and fall with the wind, never fighting more than they must. Every motion wastes nothing. The Vikings mirrored that behavior. They believed that to travel well, one had to sail like a bird, responding, not resisting. The ship beneath you feels suddenly light, almost airborne. A faint academic mystery lingers about whether certain birds were regarded as sacred guides. Some texts suggest that ravens were not only navigators but symbols of Odin himself, messengers between worlds. Others think that belief was metaphor layered onto older habits of observation. Whatever the case, when a bird appeared far out at sea, it was never ignored. It meant direction, and perhaps also protection. Imagine the feeling of spotting the first gull after days of fog. The crew would shout, faces bright with relief. That single flick of wings meant the voyage was nearing safety. The smell of land might follow soon after, or the faint brown streak of a distant coastline. Even the sound of those birds, their cries slicing through silence, felt like music after weeks of emptiness. Modern sailors sometimes rediscover this. Bird migration maps still trace the same corridors Viking ships once followed. The North Atlantic remains alive with wings at certain seasons, though few today look up long enough to notice. The old navigators did not have the luxury to ignore what flew above them. They needed every clue, every flicker of movement. You glance upward again, the gulls now shrinking into tiny dots. The wind whistles softly through the rigging. The helmsman adjusts course slightly, perhaps imitating what his ancestors did 1,000 years ago when birds showed the way. There is a deep humility in that gesture. It acknowledges that wisdom often comes from creatures smaller than ourselves. As the sun rises higher, the birds drift away toward unseen cliffs. The sea grows empty once more, but the image stays with you, the arc of wings, the promise of land somewhere beyond the edge of sight. You realize that navigation is not only about finding a place on a map, it is about listening to the world around you until it speaks. The ship continues forward, guided now by instinct, by rhythm, by the faint memory of flight still echoing in the sky. Somewhere ahead lies new land, waiting for those who know how to read its signs before they ever see its shore. The day brightens slowly, the sea-like polished stone beneath a cloudless sky. You lean over the rail, peering down into water so clear that you can almost see its color shifting from turquoise to steel. The Vikings understood this language of shades. For them, color was not decoration, it was measurement, orientation, even prophecy. Archaeological records from ship routes suggest that Viking sailors often steered by hue, distinguishing safe depth from danger simply by how the water looked. Near the coasts of Norway, the water turned green where sunlight struck shallow sand. Over deep trenches it darkened to blue-black, signaling caution. That awareness came not from theory but repetition, centuries of eyes learning to translate light into knowledge. A detail preserved in a 13th century saga mentions that when the sea greened with foam, it meant plankton were near and fish were plentiful. What sounds like a metaphor is actually early ecology. Marine scientists now confirm that plankton blooms change the color of the sea, shifting it toward bright green in nutrient-rich zones. The Vikings read these patterns with unspoken expertise. One curious fragment from a later chronicle tells of sailors who claimed to see white ghosts moving beneath the hull. They described them as ribbons of brightness that appeared only before storms. At the time, no one could explain them. Modern science calls it bioluminescence, microorganisms glowing in disturbed water when oxygen levels change. The sailors could not name the cause, but they knew what it meant: rough weather on the way. You lean farther over and catch a flicker of silver as a shoal passes below. The Vikings would have noticed that too. They called such flashes sea mirrors, believing that the ocean revealed its health through its brightness. Dull water meant stillness or death. Shining water meant motion and life. To them, light itself was a living presence. It is recorded that some navigators carried polished bronze bowls to collect seawater during their voyages. They watched the color change as the liquid settled. When it turned cloudy, they knew they were near river mouths or melting ice. When it remained clear and blue, they were deep in the open ocean. These small observations built a vocabulary of color more precise than any modern map. Scholars continue to puzzle over how far this perception went. Some argue that the Vikings developed their own kind of chromatic compass, associating subtle shades with direction. The idea remains speculative, but patterns in old sailing songs hint at it. Certain verses describe eastward blue and westward green, suggesting consistent associations between color and cardinal orientation. Whether this was coincidence or method is still an open question. As you gaze into the rippling depths, the water shifts again. Now it glows faintly with reflected light from the sky, a surface alive with motion. The Vikings saw in that shimmer something divine. They spoke of Aegir, the sea god, stirring his golden cauldron to mix currents and tides. The foam was his brew, the color his mood. Belief and observation blended seamlessly. Faith sharpened focus rather than replacing it. Modern sailors sometimes rediscover this instinct without realizing it. They talk about the feel of a sea, the way color changes with temperature, the tone of light under different skies. The Vikings lived by those cues. A green horizon might mean shallows. A sudden grayness could mean incoming fog. Even the brightness of distant water revealed the direction of sunlight filtered through clouds. You crouch at the edge of the deck, watching sunlight refract through a thin film of foam. The colors deepen: green, gold, blue, and white, all weaving together. It feels almost hypnotic. Somewhere in that shimmer lies a map, one that cannot be drawn but must be felt. You imagine the crew doing the same centuries ago, every eye trained to catch the slightest shift. There is a story of a helmsman who navigated through ice fields by studying the water's tint. He claimed that certain shades of blue revealed safe passages between flows. Researchers who studied Arctic explorers centuries later found the same technique in use. The water near ice indeed reflects different wavelengths depending on thickness and depth. That insight had survived through oral tradition long after anyone remembered where it began. You straighten up, the wind brushing your face. The sea stretches outward in endless gradients of color, each one holding a secret. The Vikings did not need to measure, they simply recognized. Perhaps that is what we have lost the patience to watch long enough for meaning to emerge. The ship moves onward, the sunlight playing across its wake. Behind you, the water brightens into silver ribbons, fading slowly back to blue. You feel a quiet gratitude for this forgotten skill, the ability to see the world not as scenery, but as information written in light. The horizon glows softly ahead, and for a moment, it feels as though the sea itself is speaking, telling you where to go. The sky begins to thicken with clouds, long grey ribbons stretching across the sun. The light dims but softens, and the wind changes pitch. Every Viking sailor knew that shift intimately. To them, clouds were not decoration. They were prophets. Each shape, each movement, each color in the sky carried meaning. As you tilt your head upward now, you realize that the heavens themselves were once a second ocean, just one they learned to sail with their eyes. In the sagas, there are lines describing captains who read the roof of the sky before setting sail. This was not superstition. Modern meteorologists recognize that many of their observations remain valid. A ring around the moon signaled moisture in the air, the forerunner of rain. High, feathery cirrus clouds meant good weather, while low, heavy masses crawling across the horizon warned of wind. You can imagine the quiet tension as a helmsman glanced upward, his expression enough to make the crew tighten the ropes without a word. A remarkable fact noted in several Icelandic texts is that the Vikings classified clouds by movement rather than shape. Instead of naming them for what they looked like, they named them for how they behaved, whether they ran, rested, or dragged across the sun. It was a system born from constant exposure, more poetic than scientific, yet perfectly suited to seafaring life. One lesser-known practice involved studying the reflection of clouds in the sea. The Vikings noticed that certain types of clouds cast clearer, brighter reflections in calm water. The sharper the reflection, the heavier the air, which often preceded fog or rainfall. Centuries later, early meteorologists confirmed that optical density in the atmosphere does affect how clouds appear on reflective surfaces. The old sailors didn't know the physics, but they knew the signs. An intriguing story from a Greenland voyage tells of sailors predicting a storm by how quickly seabirds dropped toward the waves. They said the birds were speaking with the sky. Scientists now understand that birds sense changes in barometric pressure before humans do. The Vikings had no barometers, yet they observed the same signals. Experience was their instrument. The air around you feels thick now, the scent of rain mixing with salt. The helmsman glances upward again, squinting toward a narrow gap in the clouds. Through it, sunlight filters like pale honey. You watch his face, calm but focused, and you understand that he is reading just as you might read a book. Each wisp, each shadow, each gleam is a sentence in a language nearly forgotten. They watched the horizon constantly, because clouds near the edge of vision told more than those above. A faint haze might reveal distant land. A bank of low fog often hid drifting ice. There's a line in one saga where a sailor claims to see through the air to find Greenland. Scholars think this was not metaphor but observation of refraction, the bending of light at high latitudes that can make land appear where none exists. To those sailors, illusion and reality sometimes merged. You can see why their weather lore became myth. When clouds moved fast and strange, they said Thor's goats were racing through the sky. When the sea glowed green under a pale sun, they said the gods were testing courage. Belief gave their world narrative, but beneath it lay genuine understanding. Their stories kept knowledge alive across generations who had no written manuals. Some modern researchers believe that the Vikings could forecast weather nearly as accurately as 19th-century sailors, purely by observation. They timed departures to coincide with the good sky, a pattern of stable, pale clouds stretching eastward. When that formation appeared, it meant 3 days of calm. It wasn't guesswork. It was statistical memory passed down in verse and rhythm. You look again at the clouds. They are moving faster now, tails fraying into mist. The light underneath turns greenish, and the waves sharpen. The ship creaks as the wind picks up, but the crew seems unconcerned. They know this kind of storm. Brief, noisy, more bluster than danger. The helmsman calls out softly, adjusting the sail, and the longship pivots gracefully. The Vikings built vessels that could respond instantly, their curved hulls slicing through waves rather than fighting them. Raindrops begin to fall, tapping gently against the deck. You listen to the sound, steady and patient. Somewhere in that rhythm, you hear the same peace those sailors must have felt. To them, weather was not a threat but a message. If you listened, you were safe. Gradually, the rain fades, and sunlight breaks through again, scattering diamonds across the surface of the sea. The clouds drift apart like curtains opening after a performance. You exhale slowly, the tension easing. Above you, the sky glows with that luminous clarity that always follows a northern storm. For a brief moment, you understand what it meant to trust the sky so completely. It was not faith in luck, but partnership with nature. They lived by observation, patience, and respect, tools as vital as any oar or sail. You lift your face to the wind, eyes half closed, and let the fading clouds carry their quiet wisdom across your skin. The sea has calmed again, rolling softly under a pale afternoon sky. You feel the rhythm of it through the soles of your feet, a pulse older than memory. Every wave carries a tone, every swell a personality. The Vikings gave those moods names, because to survive, you had to understand the sea's emotions. It was never just water to them. It was a living force with tempers, habits, and days of rest. In the sagas, the sea is described as a being that can smile or frown. Calm waters are said to purr like a cat, while stormy ones snarl and bite. Such language might sound fanciful now, but it captures something deeply practical. Recognizing these moods was not about poetry. It was about prediction. A faint shimmer on the horizon might mean playful swells, harmless and rhythmic. A green-black surface with low humps meant rising wind and danger. Each texture told a story. Mariners' journals from later centuries echo this same skill. They refer to whispering seas that precede calm weather and nervous seas that tremble before storms. Modern meteorologists note that subtle vibrations do shift in pressure changes, altering the way water behaves. So, when a Viking sailor said the ocean was uneasy, he was making a precise observation in poetic form. One vivid account from an Icelandic poem describes how sailors would listen to the difference between rolling swells and breaking chop. Long, even waves meant deep water. Short, chaotic bursts meant reefs or shoals. Sometimes, when waves broke oddly 1 in 3 larger than the rest, they called it a hunger sea, believing it sought a sacrifice. Behind the myth was real danger. Rogue waves, unpredictable and powerful. An unexpected anecdote survives from a 10th century voyage to the Hebrides. The crew reported that the sea hummed before it spoke. They meant that faint vibrations rose through the hull before any visible change occurred. Some scientists suggest they were hearing infrasonic frequencies produced by pressure fronts and undersea movement. Without understanding the physics, the Vikings still used this as an early warning. You crouch, placing your palm flat on the deck. The ship rocks gently, and you can feel that same vibration. It's faint but steady, a deep murmur that never stops. No wonder they treated the sea as alive. It literally sings if you're quiet enough to hear it. They also believed that each body of water had a mood distinct from others. The Norwegian fjords were sleepy, the North Sea sharp, the Greenland waters cruel. These labels came from centuries of repeated experience. When one sailor described a lazy current, everyone knew it meant slower swells but treacherous undertow. The sea's personality became a shorthand for survival. Some of their expressions still survive in Scandinavian languages today. Words like brimrote, surfroot, and sagrunur, sea rumble, carry echoes of those old instincts. To name something is to respect it, and naming the sea's moods gave them power over fear. There's a passage in one saga that tells of a storm where the sea turned black as ink. The crew said it ate the light. To them, that was a sign not just of danger but of betrayal, the ocean turning against its own travellers. Yet even then, they didn't curse it. They spoke to it, promising gifts when the voyage was done. Whether that was prayer or psychology, it worked. Belief steadied trembling hands. Modern oceanographers often speak of the sea as chaotic, unpredictable. But perhaps that chaos is only unreadable because we've forgotten its language. The Vikings saw pattern where we see noise. They could tell when a storm would pass and when it would linger. They could sense when the sea would rest again. Their skill wasn't magic, it was attention refined into instinct. You gaze out at the horizon now. The water shimmers like molten silver, calm but alert. It reminds you of a giant animal breathing in its sleep. The ship rocks gently, the air thick with salt. Every creak of timber and sigh of rope seems part of the same living rhythm. When sailors returned home after long voyages, they often said that the land felt strange beneath their feet, as if it were the sea frozen in place. Their bodies missed the movement. They had learned to match their balance to the waves so completely that stillness made them dizzy. You sense a little of that yourself now. standing on this gently rocking deck, feeling the sea's slow heart beating beneath you. The Vikings might have described this calm as the sea's smile. They knew it wouldn't last, but for now it was mercy. They would rest, eat, sing softly, and thank the water for its gentleness. The sea, unpredictable as ever, listened. You close your eyes and let that pulse move through you, the soft lift, the slow drop, the eternal breathing of the ocean. It's easy to imagine how sailors once spoke to it like a friend, half in fear, half in love. Maybe that's the truest thing they ever knew, that the sea's moods mirror our own, shifting from calm to fury to forgiveness, and back again. Night drifts in slowly, carrying a cool wind that smells of salt and rain. The stars begin to fade behind gathering clouds, and the sea darkens into polished glass. The crew grows quieter, moving with practiced ease as the wind changes. Somewhere forward, a man murmurs what sounds like a prayer. Another tosses a small coin into the water. You realize you are watching the boundary between science and superstition, though in the Viking world, those two things were never separate. They lived in a time when observation and belief shared the same bed. To them, understanding the world meant listening both to what the senses revealed and to what the unseen might whisper. A sailor could measure a shadow, study a current, and still ask the gods for guidance in the same breath. No contradiction existed between faith and logic, each strengthened the other. Archaeologists have uncovered small amulets aboard Viking ships, carved bits of wood, smooth stones, and bones wrapped in cloth. These were charms for safe passage, carried not as decoration but as part of the ship's working equipment. They were often placed near the mast, where wind and fate met. In one burial site, a fragment of birch bark was found inscribed with runes that translate roughly to, "May the sea see me kindly." That single sentence holds their worldview in miniature knowledge paired with reverence. A curious custom mentioned in early Norse writings describes sailors scratching runes into the hull before launching. The marks represented wind, luck, or calm seas. It is difficult to know whether they believed these signs physically affected the ocean, or whether they were simply ways to focus intention. Some researchers think the carvings worked as psychological anchors, helping the crew face fear with a sense of control. Others insist the rituals were genuine attempts at communication with divine forces. The truth likely sits somewhere between both. One legend tells of a helmsman who refused to sail without a small pouch of earth from his homeland tied to the stern. He said it reminded the ship where to return. Historians debate whether such stories are literal or symbolic, but the sentiment feels deeply human, the longing for connection in a world of uncertainty. Even the shape of their ships reflected a blend of faith and practicality. The curved prows carved with dragons or serpents were not mere ornament. They were meant to frighten spirits of storm and mist, invisible entities thought to dwell in certain seas. Yet when approaching friendly harbours, the crew often covered the carvings with cloth to avoid scaring local land spirits. It was etiquette for the unseen world. To modernize, this might look quaint, but to the Vikings, balance between respect and reason was essential. You glance around the deck as the wind stiffens. The men tighten ropes and check the sail's edge. Their movements are deliberate, almost ritualistic. It is difficult to tell where work ends and ceremony begins. They whistle to the wind, not as jest but as invitation. That sound, sharp and bright, is said to please Njord, the god of seafarers. The superstition that whistling can summon wind still lingers among sailors today. In one saga, a captain hesitates before leaving harbour because the waves growl without mouths. The crew waits until dawn when the sea quiets, believing that the water spirits have been appeased. From a modern viewpoint, it could simply mean the tide changed, the wind calmed, and the danger passed. Yet that willingness to treat nature as conscious may have helped them survive. If you believe the sea listens, you pay attention to every sound it makes. The rain begins, light at first, pattering softly across the deck. You notice how no one curses or complains. Instead, they speak softly to the sky, their words half chant, half comfort. This is what made their world so different from ours. They did not separate knowledge from reverence. To know something deeply was to respect it. There are still puzzles historians argue about. Some claim that the Vikings' understanding of weather patterns was purely empirical, built on observation. Others argue that ritual and myth played an equal role in decision-making. Perhaps they are both right. In a world without instruments, intuition and imagination had to share the same space. The Vikings had no need to name one science and the other faith. They were simply two ways of keeping alive. As the night deepens, thunder murmurs far away, low and patient. Lightning flickers on the horizon, lighting up the clouds from within. The crew moves slower now, conserving energy, trusting the rhythm they know so well. The storm is not punishment or surprise, it is part of the pattern, and somewhere in that acceptance lies the heart of their wisdom. You stand still, the rain cooling your face, the ship rocking beneath your feet. The sea glows faintly each time lightning flashes, revealing a silver path across the water. It feels almost sacred, as though something vast and kind watches from beyond the storm. Perhaps that is what the Vikings understood most profoundly, that awe itself was a kind of knowledge, a bridge between mystery and truth. The sea quiets after the storm, breathing in long, gentle sighs. Mist clings to the water like smoke, soft and silver in the dawn. The air tastes clean again, sharp with salt and faintly sweet from seaweed. You hear a sound beneath the surface, a deep rush, like wind trapped underwater. The crew leans over the side, peering into the dim green world below. Then you see it, a shadow the size of the ship itself sliding beneath the waves. A whale. To Viking sailors, whales were not just animals. They were companions, omens, even guides. The Norse word for whale, halva, carried connotations of wisdom and age. Stories told of whales leading ships towards safe harbors or away from hidden reefs. Others warned of the Hufgufa, a creature so vast that sailors mistook it for an island until it sank beneath them. Some believed that when whales surfaced near calm waters, the voyage was blessed. When they disappeared for days, trouble followed. Archaeological evidence supports how deeply these creatures influenced Norse life. Carved whale bones were found in coastal settlements, shaped into ornaments and tools. Whale oil was prized for lamps that burned brighter than any other fuel. But the relationship went far beyond utility. The Vikings saw in whales something divine, creatures who crossed worlds, swimming between the known and the unknowable. A rare detail recorded by a later Icelandic historian describes how sailors used the songs of whales to navigate. He wrote that experienced men could hear the hum of life beneath and tell whether the animals swam in deep or shallow water. Modern research shows that whale calls do change with depth and temperature, echoing differently through various layers of the ocean. It is entirely possible that those ancient mariners noticed the same. Another curious fragment of lore tells of a voyage to Greenland, where the crew followed a pod of whales for days, trusting their path to lead them through fog. When land appeared, they offered part of their catch back to the sea in gratitude. Whether that story is true or not, it captures the spirit of the time, the belief that listening to life, not just to the elements, could reveal direction. Some scholars still wonder whether such stories were metaphorical or literal. Perhaps the Vikings followed whales because they hunted near nutrient-rich currents, currents that also favored navigation. Perhaps it was instinct shaped by generations of observation. Whatever the case, their respect for those creatures endured. To kill a whale without reason was considered bad luck. Even warriors, fierce in every other respect, hesitated before striking something so immense and intelligent. You imagine the sound now, the low, haunting call that travels farther than any human voice. It vibrates through the ship's hull and settles in your bones. The men listen in silence, their faces calm, their eyes reflecting faint moonlight. In this moment, no one doubts that the ocean is alive. The song fades, but the peace it leaves behind lingers. There is a tale of a chieftain who claimed a white whale had saved his ship from destruction. When a storm rose suddenly, the creature surfaced beside them, breaking the waves and calming the water. Whether myth or coincidence, the story passed into legend. Modern scientists have documented cases where whales disrupt surface waves simply by moving near them. Perhaps this man's miracle was just the physics of motion, but that doesn't make it less wondrous. Later, you hear laughter as the crew shares fragments of old sea songs. Many of them mention whales, comparing them to gods or mountains that breathe. Some verses describe whales carrying souls to the afterlife, swimming through stars instead of water. The image stays with you, the idea that every voyage might have a guardian below, unseen yet present. You lean on the rail again, peering into the glowing blue beneath the surface. It feels endless, full of life. A single ripple crosses the calm, spreading outward until it vanishes into distance. Perhaps that's how wisdom travels too, one motion in deep water, unseen but everlasting. The Vikings might not have called it science, but they understood connection. They saw themselves as part of a world where animals, humans, and gods all moved within the same pattern. Every whale's breath, every wave's rise, every gust of wind belonged to the same great rhythm. You stand quietly now, listening for another sound from below. There is none, but the silence feels full, like the pause between heartbeats. For a moment, you sense what they must have felt, small yet not insignificant, surrounded yet never alone. The ship creaks softly, the ocean rests, and somewhere far below, the deep world hums with stories still untold. The morning fog lingers like smoke, and the sea stretches into grey infinity. The horizon seems to waver, neither near nor far, as though the world itself is breathing in and out. The crew moves cautiously, their eyes narrowed against the haze. To them, this is not merely poor weather, it is a test. The Vikings knew that the ocean could play tricks on the senses, twisting sight and distance into illusions. Every sailor has faced it, that strange moment when the line between water and sky disappears. The Vikings called such times the sea's deceit. They spoke of false horizons, of lights that danced where no land existed, of ghost ships that vanished when approached. Some of these were stories told to keep apprentices alert, but others came from hard experience. Today, science calls these effects refraction and mirage. Back then, they were signs that the ocean was toying with perception. One documented phenomenon from northern waters still bears their mark: the Hillinger, a shimmering reflection of distant objects caused by layers of cold and warm air. Sailors might see mountains floating above the horizon or islands hovering upside down in the sky. Many early explorers swore they saw entire coastlines that later vanished. Some historians believe that sightings of mythical lands like High Brazil or the Western Paradise may have come from such illusions. A fascinating record from the 12th century describes sailors chasing what they thought was a coastline for half a day, only to find nothing but open water. Their leader, an old helmsman, warned them not to trust their eyes when the air danced. He advised steering by the feel of the wind instead. That choice saved them, for they later found they had been drifting toward hidden rocks. His wisdom, though wrapped in mythic language, reflected a keen understanding of optical distortion. Modern atmospheric scientists have confirmed that these effects are particularly common in Arctic waters, where temperature gradients bend light in unpredictable ways. What the Vikings described as the sea lying was in fact a sophisticated observation of physics they could not name. They accepted that the world sometimes deceived the senses, but rather than despair, they developed strategies to test what was real. A curious practice arose among some navigators. When visibility faltered, they would lower themselves close to the water's surface to check the horizon. If the line seemed to lift or shimmer, they knew it was false. If it stayed steady, it was safe to trust. It's a primitive but effective form of verification centuries before instruments could correct for human error. The stories they told around this phenomenon are filled with both wonder and warning. One legend tells of a mirror sea where a ship could see its own reflection sailing upside down beneath it. Another describes a ghost fleet moving in perfect silence, which vanished when a sailor spoke its name. These tales might sound supernatural, but they echo what scientists now call the Fata Morgana effect, a type of layered mirage that creates inverted or duplicated images over water. You imagine the tension such illusions must have caused. Imagine standing on the deck, exhausted after days of fog, when suddenly a coastline appears out of nowhere. The crew cheers, land at last. But hours later, it remains the same distance away, or worse, fades into mist. Hope turns to confusion, and confusion to fear. For people who trusted their senses, absolutely. That betrayal of sight must have felt like the sea playing tricks for its own amusement. Yet not all deceit was malicious. Some sailors claimed that the ocean tested those it favored, granting glimpses of future journeys or distant lands yet to be reached. To dreamers and poets among them, the mirages were promises rather than lies. Even modern psychologists might say they were right in a sense. The mind, under stress and isolation, projects meaning onto the uncertain. The Vikings turned that uncertainty into story, and in doing so, tamed it. One unusual discovery supports their keen observation. Ice cores from Greenland contain layers of volcanic dust that sometimes created a faint glow across the North Atlantic sky. Sailors mistook this pale radiance for distant land or supernatural light. Their mistake was natural. The air itself was scattering light differently. Even their errors were forms of learning. As you watch the mist shift around the ship, shapes begin to appear and dissolve: a tower, a ridge, a city made of vapor. For a moment, you feel what they must have felt: awe mingled with caution, a reminder that the world can both guide and mislead. You blink, and the image fades. The helmsman keeps his gaze low, steady on the waves rather than the horizon. His calm steadiness feels contagious. The lesson is simple yet eternal. The sea may lie, but the water's movement never does. A true sailor reads motion, not mirage. You take a breath, tasting the cool, damp air. The fog begins to thin, the sky lightening above. What remains of the illusions melts into truth, and land appears far ahead, small and solid this time. The ship holds course, unhurried, as if it already knew that patience would reveal what sight could not. Night falls quietly, the sea settling into its long, steady rhythm. The crew moves like shadows on the deck, wrapping cloaks around their shoulders. You hear the soft rasp of rope against wood, the sigh of the sail, the occasional murmur of a man half asleep at his post. Life on board a Viking ship was not all storms and conquest. Most of it was this: waiting, listening, surviving the long hours when nothing happened except the endless conversation between body and sea. The watches divided the night. One group rested while another stayed awake, eyes scanning the darkness. They called these shifts Vaktar, and each had its song or chant to mark time. You imagine yourself in their place, the cold biting at your hands, the stars sharp and silent overhead. Every few hours, someone whispers a change of guard, and footsteps shuffle quietly past you. The rhythm never stops. Historical evidence paints a surprisingly intimate picture of life aboard these vessels. Excavations of Longship remains show small sleeping spaces near the oar benches, lined with animal skins or wool blankets. Each sailor carried a personal chest that doubled as a seat. Inside were his clothes, tools, and a few keepsakes. A carved comb, a lucky charm, perhaps a scrap of home, woven cloth. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a purpose. The crew's meals were simple but filling: dried fish, hard bread, cheese, and ale when it could be spared. Fresh water was stored in wooden barrels, guarded carefully, for brine and thirst were constant enemies. Archaeologists even found traces of herbs in ancient storage jars, proof that some sailors seasoned their food to break the monotony. You can almost smell it now, a faint mix of smoke, salt, and dill rising from the small fire in a metal pan. They sang to keep rhythm during rowing, long, slow chants that echoed over the waves. Some songs were workmanlike, timed to each pull of the oar. Others were half lullaby, half prayer melodies meant to soothe the sea itself. A line from an old saga says, "The ship sleeps when the men sing." Perhaps it was true. The deep sound of voices, the weight of harmony, might have steadied the hull in rough water. You close your eyes and listen. The song fades into the distance, replaced by the hush of waves against wood. Somewhere below deck, a man mutters in his sleep. Another adjusts his blanket. The air smells of sweat and tar, human and sea mingled together. It is not unpleasant. It is life condensed into motion, endurance, and patience. There were superstitions for the night, too. No one whistled after dark for fear of calling the wind too soon. No one sharpened a blade under the stars. It might offend spirits of iron. These rules kept hands busy in the daylight and still at night, a kind of rhythm between rest and readiness. You think about what it meant to sleep here, surrounded by uncertainty. The horizon could bring storms, or calm, or nothing at all. Dreams must have come mixed with motion. Some sailors said they dreamed of land each night, but woke to endless water. Others claimed that in the darkest hours, they felt the ship drift between worlds, the living sea above, the ghostly one below. Modern researchers studying sleep patterns on small vessels note how constant movement changes the human sense of time. You never quite enter deep rest. You hover, half aware, always listening for change. The Vikings endured this for weeks or months, yet their accounts rarely mention complaint. Fatigue was simply part of the sea's bargain. Occasionally, a story surfaces of humor amid the hardship. One fragment tells of two sailors arguing over whose snoring sounded like thunder, keeping the crew awake. Their captain solved the dispute by assigning them opposite watches so each could sleep without the other's storm. You can almost hear the laughter echoing through the dark, rough voices softened by exhaustion and camaraderie. You walk toward the stern, where the helmsman stands alone. His eyes reflect faint starlight. He nods slightly but does not speak. The tiller moves with small, practiced motions, keeping the course steady. Behind him, the sea stretches into blackness, limitless yet strangely gentle. The sound of waves against the hull is hypnotic now, a steady lull that seeps into your bones. There is comfort in this repetition, a rhythm as reliable as a heartbeat. You sense how these sailors found peace not in safety but in routine, the daily motions that kept fear away. To live like this required faith not in gods or stars, but in habit. Every rope tied the same way, every tool placed exactly where it belonged. The smallest ritual became an anchor against chaos. You lie back on a folded cloak, eyes half open to the sky. The ship rocks you as if in a cradle. Somewhere, someone hums an old verse, a tune that rises and falls with the movement of water. It feels less like a song and more like breathing. The world narrows to the creak of wood, the rhythm of waves, the soft pulse of life in the dark. You understand now why the Vikings called the sea the Long Road. It wasn't just distance, but time itself stretched thin, each night folded into the next, a quiet space where work, fear, and wonder blended together. Sleep was not escape, it was surrender to that rhythm. And as the ship glides on through darkness, you drift with it, somewhere between waking and dreaming, carried by a heartbeat made of wind and water. Morning arrives pale and cold, the horizon drawn in mist. The longship rocks gently, its timbers sighing after a quiet night. You feel the faint tremor of oars being moved, the creak of leather against wood. The sea smells different now, tinged with the sweetness of foreign shores. The Vikings were not only explorers or warriors, they were traders who followed the veins of the sea to every reachable coast. You can imagine them at dawn, tightening ropes, checking sails, speaking in low tones about markets and goods. Silver from the east, silk from the south, furs from the north, amber gathered from Baltic beaches. Their ships carried the world's currencies of the early Middle Ages. Yet what they traded most skillfully was knowledge. Every voyage was an exchange of stories, languages, and skills. Archaeological evidence paints a picture of wide connections. Norse beads have been found as far as Baghdad. Coins stamped with Arabic script have been unearthed in Sweden. The so-called Viking trade routes were arteries of culture, stretching from the White Sea to the Black, from Dublin to Constantinople. To navigate such distances without maps required not only courage, but a near spiritual attention to the sea's patterns. An account written centuries later in the King's Mirror describes how sailors chose their time to travel south by watching bird migrations and the colour of the waves. Pale green water meant cooler currents, good for northward journeys. Dark blue meant the warmer flows that helped southbound ships. These were not guesses. They were the product of generations of quiet, repeated observation. One small discovery in a Danish burial mound revealed trade in miniature, a wooden box filled with peppercorns. It might seem trivial, but pepper came only from India in that age. The merchant who carried it had travelled, directly or indirectly, across half the known world. He likely could not name the lands between, but he knew every harbour, every current, every custom house that linked them together. The Vikings saw no contradiction between being raiders and merchants. In one season they might take spoils by force, in another trade the same goods peacefully. Their ships made both possible. The same long, narrow hull that sliced through surf in battle also slipped easily into shallow rivers for commerce. Because of that, they reached inland cities that few Western Europeans had ever heard of. They bought honey in Novgorod, sold furs in Kiev, and bartered iron in the markets of Byzantium. You picture one of those harbours now. The air smells of tar, spices, and smoke. Wooden stalls line the shore, filled with copper, glass, and wool. The crew unloads goods with practiced rhythm, stacking barrels, counting coins. They speak bits of half a dozen tongues, mixing Norse with Slavic, Greek, and Arabic. To live this life meant being a bridge between worlds. What fascinates historians most is how the Vikings managed to keep such vast routes alive without written contracts or maps. Trust, reputation, and oral record were their tools. A man's word mattered more than his sword. If a sailor cheated a partner, news travelled faster than any ship. Honour was currency, and navigation of character proved as vital as navigation of seas. One overlooked clue to their trading success lies in the construction of the Nar, their cargo ship. Unlike the long, sleek warships, the Nar was broader and deeper, built to carry weight. It was slower but remarkably stable. Tests with modern replicas show that it could hold up to 20 tons of goods and still ride smoothly in rough water. That stability made long routes possible and transformed Vikings from mere raiders into global traders. You step closer to the railing, watching the crew adjust the sail. A gust of wind fills it, and the ship lurches forward with calm determination. Somewhere ahead lies another port, another culture, another story. For a moment, the distance between continents feels smaller than the space between heartbeats. Scholars have often asked what drove them to keep exploring. Was it greed, curiosity, or necessity? The truth likely combined all three. In a world where farmland was scarce and winters long, the sea was both livelihood and escape. Yet even after wealth poured back to their homelands, voyages continued. Perhaps discovery itself had become their trade, a kind of restless hunger that could never be satisfied. You watch sunlight break through the clouds, laying gold across the waves. The water glitters like coins scattered across the surface. Maybe that image crossed their minds too as they steered toward distant markets. Profit, adventure, and wonder merged together until they were indistinguishable. As evening falls, the crew settles around a small brazier, its glow soft against their faces. Someone hums a tune learned from a trader in faraway Miklagard, the city we now call Istanbul. The melody carries across the deck, mingling with the scent of salt and smoke. For a moment, the ship feels less like a vessel of commerce and more like a floating piece of the world's fabric, woven from every shore it touched. You sit quietly, warmed by the fire, watching sparks drift upward. The sea around you glows faintly under the setting sun. You realize that trade was more than exchange of goods, it was exchange of vision. Each voyage stretched the map of what was possible, and in doing so, reshaped the very idea of home. The sun rises over a coastline still wrapped in mist. Behind the ship, the sea glitters faintly, calm after so many restless nights. Ahead, the land begins to take shape. Dark slopes, a strip of sand, a few distant huts where thin columns of smoke curl into the morning sky. For the men aboard, this sight is both relief and longing. For every sailor who left home, someone stayed behind to watch the horizon. The Vikings' world was never only about those who sailed, it was also about those who waited. The wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters who lived along the fjords learned the language of the sea from the shore. They watched the wind's direction in the smoke of their hearths, counted the days since departure, and read the tides as if they were letters sent by the ocean itself. In some Icelandic sagas, women are described as keepers of weather wisdom. One fragment mentions a farmer's wife who could predict the return of ships by how the clouds bent around the mountain. She would hang clean cloths outside as a sign for the village. If the fabric stayed dry through the night, the winds favored homecoming. If it grew damp, the sea would hold her men a little longer. It might sound like folklore, but humidity and airflow around cliffs truly do shift before storms. Archaeological digs at coastal settlements have revealed charms and tokens left in doorways, small pieces of driftwood tied with thread, stones shaped like boats, shells arranged in circles. These were offerings not for gods of war but for gods of waiting. They represented patience, hope, and faith in tides. Each object held a quiet conversation with the sea. One touching account from later Norse chronicles describes a woman in Norway who kept a lamp burning in her window for every night her husband was gone. Locals called it a sea eye. The flame was small, but sailors swore they could see it flicker even from the fjord's mouth. Modern historians think these lamps served as navigation aids too, though that practical purpose never diminished their emotional weight. You can picture it now, a house built of timber and turf, the air rich with the scent of smoke and salt. Children sleep by the fire while their mother steps outside, wrapping a cloak around her shoulders. She gazes at the dark water, searching for lights that might mean a ship approaching. The waves reflect faint stars. She listens. Somewhere far out, her husband listens too, both of them tuned to the same sound. Women in Norse communities also managed the economy while the men were away. They traded goods, oversaw farms, and handled legal disputes. On the strength of that quiet authority rested entire families. Some historians call them the first true maritime entrepreneurs, navigating markets of land as deftly as their husbands navigated waves. They knew the cost of weather, the value of timber, and the price of salt. Their knowledge of sea and soil balanced the economy of exploration. There is a legend from Greenland about a priestess who could hear when ships neared port. She would place her hands in a bowl of water and wait for the ripples to change. Sailors returning home claimed her predictions were almost always correct. Perhaps she had learned to read faint tremors in the air or subtle shifts in wind pressure. Or perhaps her intuition was the sum of endless waiting, tuned to patterns others ignored. The emotional weight of these silent watchers left its mark in poetry. Old Norse verse often speaks in the voice of women who dream of ships. They see their loved ones returning, their sails like swans against the dawn. Then the vision fades, and the horizon is empty again. In those lines lives a universal ache, the knowledge that love at sea must always balance hope with loss. Modern scholars studying Viking settlements often note how many coastal graves contain both seafaring tools and domestic symbols. A ship's nail placed beside a spindle, a fishing weight next to a weaving comb. The pairing suggests that land and sea were never truly divided. Every voyage was shared, even by those who never stepped aboard. You stand on the deck now, the coastline slowly approaching. Somewhere along those shores, countless women once stood exactly where you are looking, scanning for shapes on the horizon. They knew how to read not just the sea, but silence itself, the kind of silence that carries distance and devotion in equal measure. The wind changes again, carrying the scent of heather and peat. Home feels close, though the sea still murmurs its last tests. You understand now that navigation was not only for those who held the tiller, it belonged also to those who stayed, who waited, who whispered to the waves at night. Their knowledge may not have been recorded in sagas, but it endured in every returning sail. The coastline fades behind you as the longship turns once more toward open water. The air feels colder now, emptier somehow, as if the old instincts have quieted. You sense it too, the change that began when men started trusting iron needles more than the sky. The compass came slowly to the north, carried by trade from the east, and with it arrived a new certainty that altered everything. The Vikings never used it, but their descendants did. And with that invention, something ancient began to slip away. For centuries, sailors had relied on their senses, on stories, and on the shared rhythm between body and sea. Then a small magnetized needle showed them direction no matter the weather. What had once been a conversation became a calculation. The compass was brilliant, yes, but it silenced part of the human dialogue with nature. When you no longer need to listen to waves or taste the air, the sea becomes a problem to solve rather than a partner to respect. Historical writings from the later Middle Ages describe how Nordic navigators quickly adopted the new tool. They called it the Leitherviser, the guide pointer. At first, it was treated with suspicion. Some thought it magical. Others feared it would anger the gods by replacing their signs. Yet convenience won. Soon, it was unthinkable to sail without it. The ocean, once alive with whispers and omens, turned into a grid of directions. An old Norse proverb recorded centuries after the Viking Age says, "The man who watches only his compass forgets the wind." That simple phrase captures the quiet tragedy of progress, precision at the cost of intimacy. The Vikings, who once read the world through touch and sound, would have found such faith in a single object strange. They knew that even a true bearing could fail if the sea itself turned against you. As navigation improved, the language of the ocean changed too. The poetic names of waves, colors, and clouds faded into maps and measurements. Currents became lines on parchment. A sailor could now cross oceans without ever learning their moods. Knowledge turned technical. Reliable, yes, but detached. Historians sometimes call this the mechanical turn in seafaring. It made travel safer and trade faster, but it also separated sailors from the living world around them. The generations that followed the Vikings no longer spoke of listening to whales or reading stars. They charted, measured, and timed. The romance of uncertainty, the dialogue between human and sea, grew quiet. It is tempting to see this change as inevitable. Progress rarely asks permission, yet something inside you mourns the loss. Standing here, surrounded by the vast emptiness, you realize that certainty does not bring comfort, it brings distance. When everything can be predicted, the wonder fades. Some scholars suggest that the loss of instinctual navigation marked a deeper cultural shift, the move from relationship to control. Where once the ocean was a teacher, now it was a territory to dominate. Ships became larger, heavier, more arrogant. Sailors trusted instruments instead of intuition. The sea stopped being alive and became a backdrop to human ambition. And yet, traces of the old wisdom persisted. Fishermen in northern Norway still speak of listening seas. Inuit navigators read the pulse of waves under ice. Polynesian wayfinders guide canoes across thousands of miles by watching birds and clouds. The Vikings' way of knowing did not vanish completely. It scattered, like seeds caught by wind, waiting for rediscovery. You think about the longships now rotting beneath layers of peat and sand. Their wooden bones lie silent, but the spirit of their craft endures. Every plank was once guided by a craftsman's instinct, every voyage steered by courage born of listening. The compass may have made the ocean smaller, but memory keeps it wide. You look down at the water. The surface ripples faintly, reflecting fragments of light. It seems to ask a quiet question. Can knowledge exist without connection? You do not answer. The sea has always been better at keeping mysteries than sharing them. The ship sails onward, guided now by both tradition and invention. The crew checks direction by sun and shadow, then glances at a small metal needle set inside a wooden box. It points faithfully north, unwavering. But you notice how the helmsman still glances toward the sky, reading clouds, feeling wind. Perhaps he doesn't fully trust the device either. Perhaps some instincts refuse to die. As night falls, the stars return, faint but familiar. The same constellations that once guided the Vikings still hang above, patient and steady. They have not forgotten how to speak. It is only we who stopped listening. You raise your eyes to them and wonder what they would say if we learned to hear again. The ship moves quietly under a pale morning sun. The sea is calm, the air cool, and the wind carries only the faint sound of ropes shifting. You can almost feel the centuries turning. The world around you may have changed, but the rhythm of the ocean remains the same. What once belonged to instinct is now studied in laboratories. Modern science has begun to circle back, tracing the paths of ancient wisdom it once dismissed as superstition. Oceanographers have spent decades studying how humans sense motion and space. They now know that our brains are capable of processing small environmental cues far beyond conscious thought. Tiny changes in wind temperature, in the color of light, even in the pattern of echoes can trigger orientation responses. What a Viking sailor once called sea sense, or half it turns out to be measurable. It is pattern recognition, honed by repetition, until it feels like intuition. Recent research in cognitive psychology supports this too. Experienced navigators show activity in parts of the brain linked not to logic, but to spatial memory and emotion. They literally feel direction rather than calculate it. The old navigators were right in trusting their bodies. The modern world, it seems, is only now catching up to what they already knew by instinct. There are experiments where scientists blindfold sailors and place them on ships under different weather conditions. Remarkably, many can still sense orientation by subtle environmental changes, the pull of current, the rhythm of swell, even pressure in their ears. The Vikings would not have found this surprising. They would have smiled, perhaps, at the idea that modern people needed machines to prove what any fisherman could tell you. The same rediscovery is happening in oceanography. Satellite maps now show invisible roads of water, currents, gyres, and drift lines that match Viking routes traced 1,000 years ago. The men who once followed foam and seabirds were mapping the same highways of movement we study with computers. They read the living ocean, and science has finally drawn the same lines in color-coded precision. Even meteorologists now look with new respect at ancient methods of weather reading. Cloud halos, changes in the scent of air, and the sudden quiet before a squall all correspond with measurable shifts in atmospheric pressure. What we call meteorology, they once called memory. The sea taught them, and they listened. There is an irony in how progress sometimes brings us back to the beginning. The Vikings crossed oceans without instruments. Centuries later, scientists with satellites confirm their methods were astonishingly accurate. All the while, the knowledge had been waiting, stored in songs, stories, and the movements of hands tying ropes exactly the same way their ancestors did. A lesser-known study from northern Norway involved fishermen who claimed to sense when they were near land even in dense fog. Researchers discovered they were unconsciously detecting low-frequency sound reflections from cliffs, the same phenomenon that allows bats to orient. The human ear, it turns out, can register these echoes too, though most people have forgotten how. The Vikings had not. Even psychology has joined this reconciliation. Scholars now argue that intuition is not irrational but the product of accumulated experience compressed into feeling. To know something in your bones is simply to remember faster. The sea trained the mind to act without hesitation, to respond before thought. For a sailor, that was not poetry but survival. You stand at the ship's edge, watching waves slide past in slow procession. The line where sky meets water looks eternal, yet you know it has been measured, charted, and scanned from space. Still, the ocean feels mysterious, as if numbers can never quite capture its meaning. The more we quantify it, the more it slips away into something deeper. Perhaps that is why people keep returning to these old ways. Modern explorers study Polynesian wayfinders, Arctic hunters, and northern sailors not for nostalgia but for truth. In their stories lies an awareness that technology can only enhance, never replace. Machines measure, but only humans interpret. You feel the wind shift against your cheek, light and cool. It carries a whisper, the same kind that must have brushed the faces of sailors long before compasses, long before clocks. For a moment, you sense what they knew, that direction is not always a point on a dial, but a conversation between body, air, and memory. The ship continues forward, tracing invisible lines across an ancient surface. The instruments hum quietly, the men watch their readouts, but you look instead to the waves. Their rhythm feels right. It feels alive. Maybe that is what science is rediscovering, that the truest form of understanding comes not from separating ourselves from the world, but from belonging to it completely. Evening falls softly, and the sea glows with that deep blue light that lingers long after sunset. The air is cool, almost still, and the ship drifts more than it sails. You stand at the rail, watching how the water reflects the fading sky. Each ripple carries a story, each wave a memory. For the Vikings, the sea was never only water, it was the keeper of everything that had ever happened upon it. They believed that the ocean remembered. In the sagas, storytellers spoke of the memory of water. They said that the sea could recall every ship that crossed it, every man who drowned, every oath shouted into the wind. To speak aloud on deck was to add your voice to that memory. Historians once dismissed this as poetic fantasy, but perhaps there is more truth in it than anyone expected. Water, after all, carries traces of everything it touches. Modern science has shown that it stores chemical histories, recording pollution, ash, even fragments of DNA. The sea really does remember, just not in the way people once imagined. What matters most is that the Vikings understood the power of story to preserve knowledge when nothing else could. Without paper or instruments, they turned to song. Every voyage was recorded in rhythm, every observation stitched into verse. These chants carried the coordinates of the North Atlantic in words easy to remember but rich with meaning. Sail when the dawn is red, one line advised. Turn when the gulls fly inland. Those phrases contained entire systems of navigation hidden inside poetry. Archaeologists studying fragments of runic carvings found near old harbours discovered short inscriptions that might have been mnemonic codes for routes. A single rune could stand for a landmark or current, a compact language of survival. What began as ritual later became record. Even after Christianity reached the north and the old gods faded, the rhythm of remembering by voice continued. When ships returned home, their tales were performed in smoky halls. The audience would close their eyes, swaying slightly to the rhythm of the recited journey. In that way, the knowledge of currents, skies, and winds passed from sailor to child, from one generation to the next. Each story strengthened the link between people and sea, making memory the truest map. It is remarkable how much of that memory survives. In some fishing villages of northern Norway, old men still recite sea verses nearly unchanged from medieval forms. They describe how to find safe passage between islands, when to expect whales, where the cold streams run strongest. The language has shifted, but the wisdom remains. These words carry a continuity that machines cannot record: the experience of living, seeing, and feeling the sea as part of oneself. A curious detail from folklore speaks of sailors who believed that forgetting the sea's sounds would bring bad luck. Before a voyage, they would sit quietly by the shore, closing their eyes to listen. They had to remember how the waves sounded when leaving home, so they could match that sound again when returning. It was a kind of auditory signature, a reminder that the ocean itself marked time by rhythm. Modern historians often compare this oral preservation to the work of later explorers who relied on written logs, yet the two are not so different. Both are records of attention, one written in ink, the other carried in breath. Where we archive data, they archived feeling. The sea's moods, the smell of kelp, the tilt of the horizon, these were the coordinates of their world. You look out over the darkening water and wonder how much of that old knowledge still flows within it. Perhaps the ocean does remember, not in stories or runes, but in the unbroken movement that connects every tide to every shore. A wave that once struck a Viking hull might still echo faintly here, rippling outward through centuries. The thought is strangely comforting. Memory, like the sea, never really disappears. It only changes shape. What was once a song on a ship becomes a whisper in a museum, or a scientific theory, or a quiet moment like this, someone standing on the edge of the world, listening to what water still knows. You close your eyes, hearing the soft rhythm beneath your feet. The ship sways gently, and for a moment, it feels as though all time folds together. The old sailors, the storms, the calm mornings, the endless journeys. Their memory lives not in books or relics, but in motion itself. The sea has always been telling the same story. We are only learning to hear it again. The night is clear again, and the sea shines faintly under the stars. The wind moves softly through the sail, making a sound like slow breathing. You stand near the bow, gazing at the open water ahead, and it feels as if time has paused. The waves rise and fall with the same rhythm they held 1,000 years ago. Every lesson, every instinct, every fragment of Viking wisdom has carried you here, to the edge where knowledge becomes reflection. What remains to learn is not new. It is what the Vikings already understood, that the sea is a teacher, and listening is its only rule. They knew that survival came from humility, not conquest. They read the ocean through every sense, aware that understanding lived in sound, light, scent, and movement. They treated the world as something alive, not as a possession, but as a presence to be honored. In our time, we speak of data and systems, of technology that predicts every gust of wind, yet the more precisely we measure, the more we forget to feel. The Vikings would have smiled at this contradiction. They might have said that the ocean cannot be learned by numbers alone because it is not an object, it is a conversation. They would remind us that silence and observation are the oldest instruments of all. Modern explorers have begun to rediscover this truth. Some scientists sail with minimal gear, training themselves to read currents by temperature and color, to listen for changes in the pitch of the wind. Others study traditional navigators from the Pacific, who, like the Vikings, guide their way by waves and stars. Each discovery leads back to the same realization. What we once called instinct is simply memory sharpened by patience. The Vikings lived inside that awareness. To them, the sea was a mirror of the mind, calm or violent, deep or still, depending on how it was approached. A reckless sailor met chaos. A patient one found guidance. They believed that the sea never lied, though it sometimes hid its answers behind fear. That faith, quiet but enduring, made them the most daring travelers of their age. You lean over the railing, listening to the hush of water against wood. The sound is ancient and familiar. In it you can almost hear the echoes of their voices, the low hum of songs that steadied the oars, the soft prayers spoken before a storm, the laughter that followed survival. Those sounds are gone, but their rhythm remains in every tide that touches every shore. The helmsman adjusts his course slightly, his hand steady on the tiller. The ship responds as if it understands. You realize that all along, the secret of their mastery was not control but harmony. They moved with the sea, not against it. They learned to trust it, to surrender without surrendering themselves. That is what we have forgotten and what we might remember again. Ahead, the horizon glows faintly, silver and gold mingling in the first light of dawn. The water sparkles like a living mirror. You breathe in the salt air, cool and sharp, and feel a quiet gratitude. The journey has been long, But the sea never failed to guide you. It only asked that you pay attention. You think of everything the Vikings left behind, the songs, the ships, the routes across continents, yet their greatest legacy is invisible. It lies in the way they perceived the world not as separate from themselves, but as something shared. They looked at the sea and saw their own reflection, fragile and powerful, lost and found in the same motion. You close your eyes for a moment, and the world narrows to sound. The waves, the wind, the slow heartbeat of the ship, it is all one rhythm now, ancient and tender. The journey that began with whispers of salt and night ends in stillness, where the ocean listens back. Now the waves grow slower, the air warmer. The stars blur into soft light as dawn stretches across the horizon. The ship drifts almost silently, carried by the same current that has always moved beneath the surface of the world. You let your breath match that rhythm, slow, calm, steady. In this quiet moment, you feel the memory of everything you've heard. The songs of birds, the hum of whales, the sigh of the wind through sails. They blend together, gentle and endless, like a lullaby older than language. The sea no longer feels vast or cold. It feels like home. The Vikings understood that peace was not found on land but within the movement of the ocean. They trusted it, surrendered to it, and learned to rest inside its power. That same calm waits here for you now. The horizon glows softly, and the water glimmers as if welcoming you back. You can let go of thought for a while. Let your body sway with the waves. Let your breath slow until it feels like part of the tide. The world is safe here. Nothing is rushing you. The sea is still speaking, but now its voice is a whisper meant for sleep. The sky brightens, the ship drifts on, and the water becomes glass again. You feel the faint pull of gravity and the warmth of the air on your skin. The voyage is complete, yet it never truly ends. You carry the rhythm with you, the old knowledge, the sound of calm, the memory of water. Sweet dreams.